I pray this message finds you doing well on this Monday morning as we continue with our work week, St. Mark Spark. We will start off today, of course, saying He is risen indeed, as we continue in our Easter season. Our opening opening psalm is Psalm 145, verses 1 through 3. I will extol you, my Lord, my God and King, and bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. His greatness is unsearchable. We are continuing in our Easter season, and we talked a little bit about this last week. We talked about the two roads that oftentimes are mentioned in the Bible, the story of the Damascus Road and the story of the Emmaus Road, and how these experiences are similar and how they are different. In a nutshell, Damascus Road experiences are those that seem to happen immediately. In the Acts of the Apostles, we have the story of Saul, who is on the way to persecute the church, and he is literally struck off his mode of transportation. He is struck blind in a blinding light, blinded by the light, and he hears the voice of Jesus saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And it sets off a conversion experience, but really about the Damascus Road, it is an instantaneous type of experience, or feels more instantaneous. And what we talked about last week was the Emmaus Road, which happened on the day of Easter, Jesus walking with his disciples. They're 7 miles. And the story goes, they did not recognize that it was Jesus who was their traveling companion, who was explaining scripture to them, explaining the necessity of the crucifixion and the resurrection. But at the end of the road, when they stopped to eat, at the end of the day, the breaking of the bread, the disciples' eyes are opened and they recognize Jesus, and he's taken from their sight, and they rejoice, but they also recall and how in their hearts it was burning, literally burning within them as they were going along the Emmaus Road. So one story is a story of something that happens very quickly. Another one is one where we look back, we recognize that God has been with us that entire time. But both stories are important about how we experience God on the road. Now, this does not need to be a literal road like the Damascus Road or the Emmaus Road. It doesn't have to be Clayton or Claymont or Baxter or any of the roads around here, or even an interstate. It's the road of our lives. It's how we experience God as we're going from one place to the next. The one thing about the Emmaus Road and the Damascus Road is that these are stories, important stories about experiencing God, but also these are stories that need to be told. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot more about the Emmaus Road or the Damascus Road, but I did think I would share a story about my own. I oftentimes will use sermon illustrations about other people, but thinking about a story of my own, and I'm not sure if it's Damascus or Emmaus or somewhere in between. There's on the road when we're driving our cars in our side view mirror, we'll see the announcement, the precaution that objects in the rearview mirror may be closer, may be larger than they appear. And so as we look behind me, one of the things that's behind me right there is an old sign, let not your heart be troubled. In my Father's house are many mansions. It's an important thing to me. I'll get into that in a second. I've got lots of books that are further over on the bookcase, many leather bound and smell of rich mahogany. But the one stuff that's right behind me that you can see is stuff that's more personal. Some of these are tchotchkes that have been collected along the way, along the road. But there are many that are up here that I treasure more than just about all of my possessions. And so the sign that I have behind me, let not your heart be troubled, it's an old sign from my grandfather's house with a biblical verse. And it comes from today's lectionary reading. And to be honest, I wasn't planning to talk about this. I was scheduled to talk about something else. But when I saw John 14 pop up on the daily lectionary, I knew I had to tell a part of my story as well. I don't suffer by nature very much from anxiety or depression. I don't really do it, if at all, really. But there was one stretch in my life when I was a sophomore in high school, and the world felt very dark and very gray for many, many months. And I don't know if it would be called clinical depression, but it's the closest I've ever been really in my life. And it was a day, and for some folks who struggle day in and day out with depression, this is no way to diminish your all's experience, simply sharing my own. But it was a time in high school where it felt every day was gray, and life was reduced to going through the motions. If it was school, if it was sports, if it was friendships, if it was hobbies, they all felt empty and they felt vacuous. And much of life was reduced to simply going through the motions. And I've been thinking a lot about that over the last couple of weeks as we've been going through this pandemic. At the time, I was struggling with trying to get a grasp, even a tenuous grasp, of the idea of infinity. And I don't know why that was coming to me at that point, but just thinking about what it really meant when we talk about world with no end and about a timeline that goes on forever. And I was trying to do this with a finite lens, the infinite trying to be understood by the finite in our brains. And I was struggling, and I was sinking, and I was slipping further and further back. Dawns would break, the sun would go down, and every day felt just about as dark as the previous one. And the thing was, there's no end in sight. At least at that point with that depression, there was no end in sight. And I've thought about really how the pandemic echoes the moans of depression. Joy-filled routines are taken away. Days come and go. Sometimes we don't even know what day of the week it is. There's no end in sight. Even as politicians, as scientists, they talk and speak about reopening the country. We don't know when this will end right now. And that way, it's very much like depression. This is a collective depression that's happening right now. And this takes hold of us with heavy hands. Heavy hands if we acknowledge it, and maybe, just maybe, harder still if we pretend it doesn't exist. So back in 1990, it had been months and months of me being filled with the dullness, and it was fueled by this absence of hope. My grandfather lived in Springfield and had lived there my entire life, just about 10 minutes from us. And we spent countless days over at his house growing up. I mean, his house was as familiar as my own. And Grandpa Burgess was Dutch, and I've told some stories I think about him in the past. He was very, very frugal. He was frugal with his clothes. He had the same clothes he had from 30 years ago with his shoes and getting the soles reattached and new soles being put on. He was frugal with his meals, eating oatmeal twice a day, and in his home decor as well. His home decor was always the exact same. It never changed in my lifetime. In the midst of my depression, though, one day, after several months, and giving him a hug goodbye as we did every time we said until next time, I looked over at something that had been there my entire life. It had been hanging there my entire life. For 15 years, I had gone in and out of that door thousands of times, and I had never noticed it and I've never taken the time to read it. But today, for some reason, on that day, maybe I think it's God said, you need to look at it. You need to read what that says. And I was surprised by joy. And what it says behind me is, let not your heart be troubled. In my Father's house there are many mansions. In the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible from John chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, it says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. And when I read that, do not let your hearts be troubled. In my Father's house there are many mansions. It was in an instant, literally in an instant, that a fog lifted. It felt like this dark and heavy drape and curtain was peeled back, and light broke through where it hadn't shone and it hadn't shined in my life for months. And I had this thought, and I had this realization, this truth that just spoke to my heart and has comforted me in dark places since, is that if God has eternity in God's hand, God has us. And if God has prepared a place for us, it means that God is with us right now. If God has tomorrow, surely God has today as well. I don't know if you're on the Damascus Road right now. I don't know if you're on the Emmaus Road. I don't know if you're on a road that feels familiar to you, or one that has been less taken. But I do know in my story that this experience is my story. And this experience is about a way that God spoke to me, and that God lifted up out of that darkness and that fog of depression. I knew it was my story, but I also know I needed to share it today. Perhaps more for me than it is for you. Perhaps in saying it, then I need to remind myself as well that the God who has seen me through difficult times before is the God who will be with us all. About that need to look backwards, maybe just like that Emmaus Road, to look backwards and say, hasn't God done wonderful things in the past? Hasn't God been with us? And so when we remember, we have comfort for today. And when we remember, we even hear in John 14, don't let your hearts be troubled. Let your hearts be free. Believe in God, believe also in Jesus. And then Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many mansions, many dwelling places, many rooms, literally saying that when it comes to die, when it comes even to give our final breath here on this earth, that God's got that as well. And Jesus at last says that where I am, you may be also as well. So this is a story that gives me hope, and I hope it gives you hope as well. But I hope you also will find hope in your own stories looking back, but also on whatever road you're on today. It may be in noticing something that has been in front of your eyes your entire life, just waiting for you to see it, waiting for you to take it to heart, waiting for you to know that it is God's comfort. It's a comfort maybe for a day, maybe for a season, maybe for a pandemic, but I trust it's a comfort for all of eternity. So may our eyes be open, friends. To wrap up from Psalm 145, verse 18, the Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desire of all who fear him. He also hears their cry and saves them. I pray that God will open your eyes, my eyes, our eyes. The God who has brought us safe this far is the God who will lead us home. I pray for God's blessings on you. I pray that you recognize it, that you see it, that you celebrate it. And I pray that you share it with someone else on your road today. May God be with you.